Thank you, Nagesh. Yes, we have been working with this study for some years now, actually. You see the co-authors here. And the question for this seminar is, are we ready for practice? Yes. So, and the idea for the study is much related to the CISINC pursuit on participatory modeling that was held by 2016 to 2018. And one idea of the pursuit was to make a review of the field. And first we tried to scan every aspect that we was interested in, and it became so much and too much actually. So we had to focus, and the focus became on process, PM process and planning process. So we want to understand what's needed to implement PM planning processes in practice. For example, in practice, participation can often be too costly. So what do we know about PM process costs from current cases? And real-world planning processes take place in governance systems. How do current PM processes relate to their governance systems? What do we know about that? And real-world participatory processes need to be democratic, and whose voices are heard in PM processes today, as we can find out by the large pool of PM case studies that we have currently. And as Nagesh told us, we have reviewed 60 PM case papers, and those were randomly selected from a larger pool of about 200 case studies that we had identified. Yes, and then we developed a PM process evaluation instrument, which came to consist of 22 questions plus follow-up questions. And they are based on two frameworks. One is more descriptive, called the CUP framework, Comparison of Participatory Processes, Hassenforder. For example, like the number and type of participants, the case, the issues of the cases, and so on. While for the process focus, we relied on a framework that I have developed. I call it the Sustainable Procedure Framework, which defines what an integrated and participatory planning process need to focus on or need to comply with. And so instead of how many participants or the type of participants, this kind of framework rather looks into on what grounds were participants identified and selected. So you understand a bit of the difference between the two frameworks. So based on those, we developed this evaluation instrument. And if you want to have a look at it, you can find it at the participatorymodelling.org site, because we put it there as a support for self-assessment or design support of PM processes. Yes, and I don't have, of course, time to go through every result, but some selected pieces. Yes, about the purpose or the objectives of the studies. Most studies, well, we see here firstly that it's quite a range of different purposes. But the most common purpose is to develop PM process. And you can also note that none of the 60 cases have the objective to arrive at an implemented decision or a binding decision. And I also think it's interesting to look at the scales of the cases. More than 2/3 take place at the regional scale, actually. And the other is mainly the local case, the local scale. And also interesting is that only one of the 60 cases explicitly made an issue out of trying to connect scales. And I think that's interesting because I think PM has such a large potential when it comes to that. Okay, number of participants. As you see here, it's quite evenly distributed between the different classes we have here. But if you look more detailed at the numbers behind this, we see that 90% of the cases actually had lower or less than 65 participants. And the two largest studies, that's really outliers. They involve 373 and 600 participants respectively. They both relied on electronic participation and on the internet. So now we come into some more procedural or process issues. And we wanted to understand how the cases dealt with the following issues: identification of participants to involve, identification of the knowledge needed for the process, identification of the most relevant uncertainties, and of the main values, how they were handled, the main values that are affected by the process, that is, and also the issue of fitting the process into the formal decision-making context. And here we were looking for if we could find descriptions of systematic approaches from the case studies. I should say, also clarify that we only relied on scientific papers here, so what they describe. So, I mean, there's always the risk that, there can be the case that they did things that they didn't report. That's quite likely, actually, but it's still interesting to see what one reports on. So, okay, systematic approach, what's that then? Well, we define it as that steps were taken within the process to ensure both comprehensive and explicit identification of the element, for example, identification of participants, and a considered and justified decision about which to include or adjust the process to. So if we look at the numbers here, we see that identification of participants to involve, only 18% of the cases applied a systematic approach here. But when it comes to identification of knowledge, more than 90% used a systematic approach or described a systematic approach. And then we come to the uncertainties. More than 62%, or more than 62% used a systematic approach to that. And then identification and handling of the main values affected, 42%. Then fitting the process into the formal decision-making context, only 15% of the cases used described a formal approach for that. Yes, and then we have issues of power. Whose voices are heard actually in these processes? Over 50% did not report any action to handle power imbalances, actually. And then we come to the issue of incentives, because that's a really important issue when it comes to participation. Why participate? And if there we have some kind of, I call it social issues, that it should be safe, feel safe or fun or important, fair to participate. Otherwise we won't do it. And here we saw that, I can't see now, but I think it's about 50% actually, more than 50% of the cases did not take any action or not report any actions to handle social incentives. And you can see the type of incentives that we were looking for. And then another type of incentive to participate is cost. Like, is it costly money-wise or time-wise, or do we need some kind of expert knowledge to participate and such? So is it too costly? It's not good, of course. So what do we know about that from the cases? Well, not much actually, because 10%, only 10% describe the resources that were required to conduct the PM process. So we know very little about this actually. And the 6 cases out of the 60 that did discuss resources, they provided only sparse and non-comprehensive accounts. So it's not possible to compare different ways of designing processes, different tools when it comes to costs. And then very important issue of evaluation. I mean, evaluation of the actual cases. Did the case studies include an evaluation of the research? Well, only 38% did actually. And out of these, only one third did not describe.
Now we have a child in the meeting.
Yes.
It's fun, but mute, please.
So many of the cases that included an evaluation in the paper did not describe how it was made. So we can do better here. Okay, conclusion. I just want to say first that PM has a really great potential for supporting planning and decision making, I guess, as you well know, in the governance of complex social environmental systems. And such governance urgently needs innovative and efficient participatory processes that can be implemented in the real world. But our assessment suggests that significant work remains for PM to be a fully effective support for participatory planning practice. So we have our jobs still here. We have things to do. The case studies often fall short of facilitating a multiple value perspective in a democratic process. And almost always they fall short of embedding the PM process into the governance system around it. But the papers we reviewed indicated that PM is already very effective at promoting knowledge integration and learning amongst the participants that participates directly in the process. And now, if we have some time left, I hope, Johanna is going to take some examples to be more specific about these focal points, to exemplify what that can mean and to start a discussion.
Yes, I will.
6 minutes, including the discussion.
Yes, I will very shortly do this, just to introduce the discussion. Bea and I have discussed this a lot, and I have worked a lot in practice or in relation to with practitioners using different types of models. And I think what the modelers and the facilitators of participatory modeling processes needs to do is to actually take care of these 3 points. And I will just say that there are a few things that we can do and 3 problems we have. We need to improve the training to facilitate participatory processes. And I think modelers need to At least they may not become facilitators, but they need to understand a bit more the dynamics of those processes. We also need more people with transdisciplinary knowledge or understanding of other disciplines. So it can be understanding the links between disciplines, but also have better knowledge in other disciplines, because that facilitates this learning process. We also lack knowledge of democratic processes and structures in general, both among facilitators and modelers. And this creates frequently issues in relation to misunderstanding of, but the model can produce so good information, but the problem is there is no place in the democratic system to actually use that knowledge. Then if we come to point 2, we need to recognize that introducing this way of working is a long process, and it will take a time, and it also needs to include, and it does include, you who are more modelers know that the model is not one thing, it's an evolving process, and we need to recognize both that democratic systems evolve slowly and those models evolve slowly. And I will not go into some examples here. I think you all have generic examples of problems because we don't have time. But if we look at what we can actually do together, is that we can identify new data. I have been in several projects where we actually have, in the participatory modeling process, identified new data or ways to collect data. So that is very, very good, because we all know that data collection is costly and time consuming. And by doing this together, we gain knowledge from the other perspectives. So actually it is a bit doing by learning. So I will just open up, mention these things and then open up for discussions. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice and Johanna. And we'll take some questions now. And we can also continue the discussion again at 3 p.m. when we have a break of 20 minutes. Yeah. Anybody who wants to ask questions can unmute themselves and ask.
Oh, if I may, Igor Nikolic at TU Delft. This is very, very interesting. Thank you so much. One thought that I had as I listened to you is, would it be possible, based on the work that you've done, to create either a protocol or a guideline for maybe reporting these case studies? For example, like the social simulation community has developed the ODD protocol for reporting ABMs. Is this something that we could do given your work, or maybe do you think would be desirable?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a good idea. We did another study actually that was particularly about this reporting question from the succinct pursuit, but it was a bit more, what topics do we need to report on? I don't know if you could use the review instrument already as a way of thinking or supporting documentation and reporting. But think that to cover all the topics that one can be interested in PM, that's so very broad. So I think the framework or the review instrument doesn't really include everything.
No. What I think you could do is to have checkpoints to actually support the process, which was focused on in this paper. But then what I talked about in the last point, like you need to have people who actually have this broad knowledge. So you can't take people with not broad knowledge in and using a checklist, because then they will miss a lot of things. Doesn't mean that you need to take into consideration everything, but you need to know that you need to take it. You should maybe at least consider it. So I think, yes, some kind of checklist of supporting the process, that it could be useful. There are checklists, there are something. I worked in processes where we have developed simple kind of process pictures and things like that. So but I think we can all do that, and while we do it, it can evolve to something more maybe joint agreed on documents.